Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, Brian Parker back with you today to host another episode of the All Me podcast. Today we're going to be talking about something that is at the core of what we do, anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids are something that we educate on every single day, so we wanted to do an episode diving into the research surrounding these dangerous drugs. That is why I'll be talking with Dr. Skip Pope. He is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and an attending physician at McLean Hospital. He's conducted research in a wide range of areas in psychiatry, and he's authored more than 300 peer-reviewed papers, many of which are on anabolic steroids and are also linked in the episode show notes from today. This expertise on anabolic steroid use is why Dr. Pope is one of the leading researchers in the world on this topic, and why he's also one of the people that helped us develop the program that we educate with today. Therefore, we thought it'd be valuable to our listeners to catch up with Dr. Pope about what he's seeing when it comes to anabolic steroid use. So in this episode, we're going to talk about why this was a topic that he wanted to do research on in the first place. What are the current usage numbers and demographics looking like? The reasons and the culture he sees as the driving force behind that usage, as well as the side effects he's seeing by users and what he thinks we will continue to learn on this topic. By having this conversation, we're using Dr. Pope's research to enlighten others about the dangers of these drugs and hopefully inspiring others to achieve their physical goals the right way. So let's bring Skip into the show and start our discussion on steroids. Dr. Pope, thanks so much for joining us. How's it going today?
Very well. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited for today's episode, selfishly for myself and for our listeners, because we're going to dive into one of the topics that we educate on every single day, and that's anabolic steroids. And I know a lot of the research you've done in this area. In fact, I think you've done as much research, if not more so, than anybody else out there on this subject matter. So I'm excited to, number one, let our listeners into the world of research that you've been doing on this stuff. But then also, for myself, I'm out there educating on this stuff every day. So I figure I'm going to learn a thing or two about what you've been seeing recently as well. So I think this will be beneficial to not just me, but anybody that tunes in. So thanks again for lending us a little bit of your time and a little bit of your expertise as well.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah. So let's dive into this thing. Let's talk about you first. We've got a lot to get to, and I want to, do you a little bit of justice before we get going and let people know what your area of expertise is. Obviously, we've already stated we're going to talk about anabolic steroids, which is part of what you do, but I know you do a little bit more than that. So rather than spend a ton of time diving into your background and how you kind of got into what you're doing now, I want you to give us a little bit of introduction into kind of what your focus is. So you're a professor of psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School. You're also attending physician at McLean Hospital. So tell us a little bit more about what your area of expertise is, even beyond anabolic steroids, and why the fields that you study in every day were something that you were interested in.
Well, over the last 47 years, I have done research and published papers all over the place in psychiatry on numerous topics. I started out doing a lot of work on psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, things like that. Then I had a long phase doing studies of eating disorders, bulimia nervosa, anorexia nervosa. Got very interested in psychopharmacology, drugs to treat major mental illnesses. Then starting in the late 80s with the elder President Bush's war on drugs, I applied for some grant money from the feds. And I got one grant to study marijuana and another grant to study steroids. And from that point on, I did maybe 50% of my time were studies doing work on various forms of substance use. First marijuana, a little bit of stuff on hallucinogens, psychedelics, a little stuff on ecstasy. But the area closest to my heart has always been anabolic steroids. I myself have lifted 6 days a week since I was in my early 30s back in 1980. So obviously I knew countless guys in the gym who used steroids from way back in the days when it was only a misdemeanor, way back in the 1980s. And so as a result, it's been an area that has interested me and where I've continued to get funding to do research studies on the effects of steroids from 1989 all the way up to the present.
That makes sense. I didn't know how far back exactly you started looking at this stuff, but that means you've basically been in it from the jump. I mean, this stuff really started to gain popularity in the 80s. So the timing was good on your end to kind of see how it started and how it's progressed, and you've been in it, ever since it really started to rise in popularity. And I know one of the platforms that you use to do your research in is something called the Biological Psychiatry Laboratory that I know you co-founded back in 1984. So tell us a little bit more about what that platform is, why you started that lab, and what the research focus is within that.
Well, the laboratory is just a research group here at McLean Hospital. McLean is Harvard's biggest teaching hospital in psychiatry. So we do not only my substance use research, but we do clinical trials of new medications to treat various psychiatric disorders. We do a lot of research on eating disorders, and then studies using neuroimaging, MRIs, to study disorders such as obsessive compulsive disorder, and numerous other topics. So the Biological Psychiatry Laboratory basically does stuff across the board in psychiatry, not just in substance use.
That's great to know. I think it gives us all a good starting point, knowing your background of how long you've been looking at these issues, and also the platforms you're still using today to continue your research. So having established your history, now I want to start our discussion on anabolic steroids themselves. And I think a good place for us to start would be why people are getting involved with these drugs. I do think changing appearance, body image pressure is the driving usage result, and kind of the culture surrounding this. In fact, before you and I were talking on this call, I listened to a lecture of yours. I listened to a couple of different things, but one of the terms that you use that I love is the supportive social climate, or the exact words you said. I say those in quotation marks with my fingers as I'm talking to you, right? So I want to take that idea and even talk about it a little bit more. So that phrase, this social climate, almost acceptance, is maybe another word we could use for that. But what do you mean by this? What climate are you inferring, and how far back does this cultural climate go?
Well, that's an important question. First, going back to what I was saying about the East versus the West, we have a culture of muscularity that goes back to Greek statues, 2,000 years ago. We have had this tradition of muscularity that comes from ancient times in the West. And if you look, for example, at the statue of Hercules that was created a couple of thousand years ago, that's now in the museum in Naples, Hercules in the statue looks just like some guy who's been taking anabolic steroids, even though the anabolic steroids were not discovered until 2,000 years later. Yeah. By comparison, in the Far East, in the Confucian tradition, for example, a masculine man in Confucian tradition is not a big muscular hump. He's a man who has force of character, who has intellect, who has integrity. So that it wouldn't occur to many people in the Far East that there would be any reason that you would want to be very muscular. However, in the West, we have this longstanding muscular tradition, particularly in the Nordic countries, the land of the Vikings and Thor and Vulcan and the Norse gods. And interestingly, in the Nordic countries that have this tradition, we have some of the highest rates of steroid use in the world. And then add on top of that, starting in about the 1970s and 1980s, there was a shift where we start to see more and more muscular images on TV, in the movies, in cartoon characters, and even in action toys. For example, if you take G.I. Joe, which was always been America's favorite male action show, when G.I. Joe came out in 1964 during the Vietnam War, if you were to take him and make him the height of an actual man, he would be a perfectly ordinary looking dude. He'd have, 12-inch biceps, 37-inch chest, nothing special. But by the 1990s, the 1970s, the 1970 G.I. Joes had already started to get muscular with a 15-inch bicep, 42-inch chest, even a bit of abs beginning to show. And then when you get up into the 90s, they become even more muscular. So G.I. Joe has not only been putting in more time in the gym, but he's maybe done a couple of cycles of juice as well. And this trend of worship of muscularity, for lack of a better word, has evolved over the last 30, 40 years, and it's not exactly clear why, but I'll give you a couple of theories. One theory is that it has to do with women's liberation. That nowadays, women can fly fighter jets, they can engage in all manner of combat and war, they can become CEOs of multinational corporations, they can do anything a man can do, except that women cannot bench 300 pounds. And so, in a way, muscularity is sort of like the last refuge of masculinity, if you will. And maybe that has helped to propel this interest in working out and male body image. Then I'll give you another theory. These are just purely theories, mind you. There's no good scientific proof of them. The other theory is that the corporate world has been making tons of money for decades and decades and decades by making women feel insecure about their bodies. And if you could make women feel insecure about their appearance, they will buy all kinds of products in the hopes of making themselves thinner and more beautiful and more fit and all this sort of thing. And I would propose that starting sometime 70s, 80s, that the corporate world wised up to the fact that, gee, there's another 50% of the market out there. If we could only make men feel insecure about their bodies, we could make a lot of money. And sure enough, you see a rise in advertising that emphasizes muscularity, products to help with fitness and muscularity, magazines devoted to working out and muscularity, that all started to flower sometime around the 70s and 80s. So this backdrop is so familiar. You and I don't even notice it any longer. We see these muscular images on billboards and ads on the subway, in TV shows and in cartoons. We see them everywhere, every day. We think nothing of it because it's become so infused into our society that we've become very accustomed to it. And I think that creates a fertile soil for men to become concerned about their body image. And the ones who get really concerned and feel insecure about body image then become particularly vulnerable to the temptation of taking anabolic steroids.
I mean, I'm sitting here nodding my head as you talk because it's so true. I mean, even the G.I. Joe example that you threw out to us is one that we also use in our presentations. I mean, everything that you're talking about is, I've never really thought much into the theories that you mentioned about why this has, kind of been the way that it is the past 30, 40 years. But I mean, both of those make sense. I've also never even really connected dots between, the Greek gods and the ancient statues looking like this is not something that's, even as new as I thought it was. It's been around for a while. And that all makes sense. It does create this climate, and this climate has gotten to the point where exactly what you're saying is it's accepted now. It almost, we don't even think twice about it. I even throw out social media nowadays. You got so much imaging coming through that on what you are quote unquote supposed to look like. Yeah, this muscularity look, and because you've got, again, people making money off of that, getting paid to show that kind of physique on social media. It's almost become, I don't want to say we're getting numb to it, because I don't think that's the right term. I don't think we're getting numb. I think what it's doing is it's creating, this concern that you talked about. I mean, that's where I want to even ask you the next question is this climate, this concern. We know that it's connecting some of the dots to anabolic steroid use as we're inferring, right? But is there a step in between? Like, is this climate, right, this concern that we're talking about, are you seeing this lead to body image disorders in particular, right? I mean, but good example, I was just reading another article before you and I talked where they were interviewing you. You had a quote. They were talking about bigorexia and how that, can be something that happens because of body image, pressure, which then leads to steroid uses. Are these body image disorders almost like a stepping stone to steroid use? How often are you seeing those kinds of things ending up leading to the drug use?
Well, we did a study, a big study between 2005 and 2010. It was published in 2012, looking at what is it that would predict which guys who walk into the gym will someday decide to take steroids and which ones will not decide to take steroids. And we recruited about 230 guys with an ad that asked simply, have you been able to bench press 275 pounds for at least one repetition? If so, you can earn money by participating in a study. So we didn't even tell them that we were specifically interested in steroids in the ad. And we got about 100 odd who had used steroids and about 130 who had never used steroids. And then we asked them a whole bunch of questions about what they had been like in their adolescent years. And the strongest single predictor of whether you would go on to use steroids or not was body image concerns. So the guys who were at the highest risk are the ones who would say, yes, doc, when I was 14, 15, 16, I got, first into weightlifting. Then I find myself, I'd be checking out to see, did I look bigger in the green shirt or did I look bigger in the black shirt? And I'd, be careful what clothes I chose. I'd check myself out when I saw my reflection in the window of a parked car that I was walking past. And then I'd look at myself in the mirror in the gym, and I think that I still look too small. And even my friend said that I was perfectly big, but I couldn't quite believe it myself, and I never felt that I was really big enough. That's where the word bigorexia got coined in the first place. And those were the ones who had the highest risk of going on. The other thing that predicted steroid use was sort of obvious, which is if people guys had a history of conduct disorder, if they had broken rules or got into fights or had trouble with authorities or doing things of that nature, they were more likely to use steroids. But that's sort of predictable that if you're prepared to do one thing that's illegal, then you're more likely to do something else that's illegal. Mm-hmm. So body image disorder plus conduct disorder were the two most powerful predictors. And the more we have looked at it in the subsequent years since doing that study, the more and more body image emerges as the core feature that tends to lead to steroid use. And to go back to your original question, people vary in what they were born with in terms of their genetics. And having body image disorder is probably related to obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD. Now, you probably know that some people with OCD are people who wash their hands 50 times a day, or who have to go back and check 6 times to see if they locked their car. That sort of that. They have obsessive thoughts or compulsive rituals. But those same obsessive thoughts and rituals can be translated into body image, that someone can get obsessed with their appearance, and they can't think their way out of it, and it becomes a dominant force that controls a great deal of their behavior. So that it may be that you are born with a predisposition to obsessive compulsive symptomatology, and if you put yourself in the right environment, that may emerge in the form of body image concerns.
I mean, it makes sense. There's so many, moving pieces here. There's so many things that link together, and at the end can create this usage. But it always fascinates me to kind of have this conversation because, how do we connect the dots? What ultimately leads to making that decision? A lot of what you said obviously makes sense. It's environment. It's part of, I don't even think too much about, are we born with something that can kind of, lead towards this? I mean, OCD, and how does that relate? I think it's all part of the puzzle here, but it's exactly the kind of stuff, mix in this body image pressure and this culture that we're talking about can lead to something like bigorexia, which again, is like this obsessive thought of like, how can I continue to get bigger? I'm not quite big enough. And that can push you to the point where you end up making the decision to use that. And I think it's all a very important discussion to have because, you probably feel the same way. I don't think it gets discussed enough. I think whenever I hear the word steroids on the news, or if casually when it comes in people's mouths or discussions, it always goes back to this athletic and cheating and against the rules and that kind of stuff. It's just a small niche, like we discussed. It's all going back to a lot of the issues
exactly.
that we've talked about. And I think it's important because at the end of the day, what that allows us to do when we look at it in that light is realize, what, this is a health issue. This is not, yes, it's a cheating issue. That's part of the puzzle, but much more importantly, it's a health issue that applies to a lot more people than we might realize because of this background, this climate, the discussion that you and I both had. So that's why I wanted to start our conversation with that, because I just think it needs to be discussed more than it is, because it does open some people's eyes into, like you said, well, we've got 3 million people using this stuff. Well, here's part of the reasons why. It's not just because they're looking for an edge on the court, right? There's a lot more that goes into that. So I appreciate you kind of giving us your insight and expertise into that area. And that kind of gives us an entryway into the next talk, right? So now we kind of know who's involved, how many people, why we're getting involved. We've got our background. Let's take that information and move it into a side effect discussion, which I know this. You and I could have a whole separate podcast just talking about side effects. There's a whole bunch that goes into that, right? But I want to dive into some of the things that you've talked about and some of the things that would happen to those people that do feel that pressure and ultimately make the decision to use, right? So let's start with here, because you actually already kind of brought this up. Before we get into like physical, mental, specific side effects, I want to talk about dependency rate, because you've mentioned before that you are seeing a lot of people, once they get involved, they do get dependent on these drugs. And I'm curious because, I get this question a lot after I present. People ask me, Brian, well, are these drugs physically addictive, right? Or is it more so that we just become addicted to the results? So I want you to speak to that, right? Does this drug use end up creating some kind of physical addiction where there is a physical need to use this, or is it more so, hey, I'm addicted to the results I'm seeing from these drugs, and that behavior, these results are what are addictive, or is it a little bit of both?
Well, it's both, and basically there are three different pathways that lead to dependence. The first one we've already talked about, which is the body image pathway. And there are guys who become very, very fixated on body image, who get on steroids, they get bigger, they get surrounded by other guys who are big, who've been on steroids, and the culture sort of reinforces that focus on body image. And then if they go off their cycle of steroids, we say a cycle, meaning a course of steroids that you take for 8 to 10 to 16 weeks, they go off, and they find that they've lost a little bit of muscle mass, and they may panic and say, good God, I'm getting smaller, and then immediately go back on again because they become so afraid that they'll lose their size. So that's one path that can lead to a dependence syndrome. Then the second path, which we have not talked about, is the endocrinological path. And as you know, when you take anabolic steroids, if you take testosterone, which is nature's own anabolic steroid, or you take a synthetic derivative of testosterone, it's the same end result. Your body sees all of these steroids coming in from the outside, and it's specifically your hypothalamus looks and says, we don't need to manufacture any testosterone. We've already got plenty coming in from the outside. And so the hypothalamus sends a chemical signal down to your pituitary gland in your brain and says, hey guys, we don't need to manufacture any more testosterone. And so the pituitary, in turn, shuts off the two sexual hormones that it manufactures, which are called luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And it shuts those down, and those hormones normally tell the male testis to manufacture testosterone and to manufacture sperm cells. But if the testis isn't getting any signal from the pituitary upstairs, it decides that there's no need to have the factory open, and the testis basically goes to sleep. And it stops making testosterone, stops making sperm cells. And then, if you've been taking steroids for months and months and you quickly stop your steroids, the testis cannot wake up instantaneously. So you can go through a long period after you stop taking steroids where your own testosterone level remains very, very low and only slowly, gradually rebounds back to normal, and sometimes doesn't even get back to normal, especially if you've been taking steroids on and off for a long time. So what happens is that these guys will stop a cycle of steroids, and they'll feel sluggish, they'll lose their sex drive, they'll have lose their erectile function, they won't have interest in going to the gym, and the temptation is very great to take steroids again to make the bad feelings go away. And so it's a self-reinforcing cycle. So that's the second path to dependence. But then, interestingly enough, there's a third path, and that is what we call the hedonic path, Hedonic, which comes from the same word as the Greek word for the same word as hedonism from the Greek. And hedonic path is that steroids do have positive feelings that they induce, especially in some people. And even if you are not taking steroids just for the muscle gains, it gives you, in many people, a positive feeling that you're powerful, that you're maybe invincible, and that can encourage further steroid use. And we know that that's a major factor because if you take male hamsters and you set them up in a cage so that they can shoot themselves up with testosterone whenever they please by poking their nose with a little nose poke device. The hamsters will self-administer testosterone over and over again, all the way to the point of death. Now, if you're a hamster, you probably don't care particularly how big your biceps look to female hamsters, and you probably aren't particularly worried about the fact that you might have a low testosterone later, because you won't be able to figure that out. So obviously, these hamsters are getting a charge out of this. They're getting some pleasurable sensation from the anabolic steroids. So that's a third factor. So you've got the body image factor, you've got the neuroendocrine factor, and you've got the hedonic factor. Collectively, all three of those are collectively conspiring to induce you to want to take steroids more and more continuously and to not stop them. And we believe that that's the reason that the dependence rate is so high. Now, just before I finish my answer to your question, steroids are different from most drugs of abuse, because most drugs of abuse deliver a reward within seconds or minutes of taking the drug. You know, if you snort cocaine, you're going to get high in a matter of seconds. If you drink alcohol, you're going to get drunk in a matter of half an hour or more, and the same for other drugs. Steroids don't deliver an instantaneous or rapid reward. You know, they have some immediate hedonic effect, but it's not like other drugs where you can get addicted to the drug and fall into a dependent syndrome that way. Instead, steroids have a more subtle pattern of causing a dependent syndrome, which is more prolonged, but actually the dependence is actually more common with steroids than it is with alcohol or with cocaine. So that we have to be concerned, not because there's any severe short-term effects that happen, an hour after you take an anabolic steroids. The problem is the long-term effects especially in people who develop this dependent syndrome and go on taking steroids on and off, or mostly on and less off for years and years of time.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up towards the end, because that's the reason why I get that question, is because these drugs are different, right? Oftentimes we think of recreational drug use and we do think of, the escape, release, instantaneous, some kind of reaction, satisfaction feeling that you get. And these are obviously different, right? But there's just so much that goes into that, right? So it's almost creating this a recipe for disaster, right? We've got this climate that's pushing so many people into it, right? Then it creates this dependency for all the various reasons that you just said. And because of that dependency, once people are in, it's very difficult to get out. And then at the end of this recipe, so to speak, right, it is creating these side effects that come on due to prolonged use. And those side effects are where I want to take our conversation next, because I know that's where a lot of your research has stemmed from. And I know it's stuff that you're still looking at, right? But what's going on with the people that, number one, do use, but then stay in it for a long time, because that's when the side effects really start to kick in, right? And there's obviously, we could talk about a whole bunch of them, but I want to start with a couple physical ones before we dive into some of the mental psychiatric side effects that you're seeing as well. But let's start with the physical side of things, right? And I want to, in particular, pull out the cardiovascular system, because I know that's the most researched issue, and that includes a lot of research on your own. So let's start there. What are you seeing going on with the heart, with blood flow, cardiovascular issues when anabolic steroid is occurring over a long period of time?
Yeah, the heart is the riskiest of the heart. The cardiac effects or cardiovascular effects are the most worrisome of the various long-term effects of steroids. And I suppose it's not surprising, because steroids act on muscle. The heart is a muscle. It is, in fact, the strongest muscle in the body, and it's the only muscle that never rests. And so if you are throwing steroids at the heart for years and years of time, it's not surprising that there might be some sorts of long-term problems. And one of those problems is a so-called cardiomyopathy. And in that case, the heart becomes less flexible, less capable of beating in a nice, powerful, coherent fashion. So when it beats, the amount of blood that goes shooting out your aorta and around your body is reduced. And then when it fills back up with blood, it stiffer. It's not rubbery and flexible like it should be. And so it doesn't fill up as efficiently as it could. And this means that you're going to be more easily fatigued, and in extreme cases, have difficulty with intense exercise. Fortunately, our data, we did the largest study to be published so far in this area, and our data and that of other people suggests that if you stop taking steroids, that you will recover a fair amount of your lost cardiac function. You may not recover all of it, but you will recover a good deal of it, so that it's not too late to stop in that respect. However, the other big effect is hardening of the arteries, so-called atherosclerosis. And we found that in guys who've been taking anabolic steroids over the long term, they gradually develop more and more atherosclerotic plaque, so-called, that blocks the arteries not only in the heart, but in the brain and other parts of the body. And this results in premature heart attacks or strokes occurring at an early age. For example, when I did the large cardiac study that we published back in 2017, I had 86 guys that I recruited between the age of 34 and 54. And of those 86 guys, 3 of the 86 had already had a heart attack before the age of 35. Before the age of 45. I'm sorry, before the age of 45. And that obviously is a much greater number than you would expect just in an ordinary sample of men less than 54. And when we looked at the arteries of the heart using a technique called CT angiography, a computerized imaging technique where you can actually see the amount of blockade in the arteries, we found that quite a number of these men, especially those who had more than 10 years of steroid use under their belts, had marked degrees of blockade in various coronary arteries and were obviously at risk for getting a heart attack. Then on top of that, there is an increased risk of forming clots and other abnormalities of the cardiovascular system that may contribute as well. But the short answer is that getting a heart attack or a stroke at a younger than normal age is probably the single most worrisome feature of steroid dependence.
Yeah, I'm with you. So much so, in fact, when we talk about side effects in our presentations, that's where we start, right? Just because, as you said, can be, one of the most dangerous things that can happen. Obviously, there's so much research around this, which a lot of it's coming from you. And I think there's probably still more to come that I know that you're looking at as well. But yeah, it just makes sense if we're talking about drugs that affect muscles. It's not like we can exclude the one that we need the most, right? So, and the other problem with this side effect is, it can take a while before, something serious really happens, right? As you said, like, it's not like this is going to happen after you take steroids the first time. It's once that dependency is created and you use it for a number of years is when the ultimate, side effects at the end of all this can kick in a bit. So I think that's just important to talk about, because even though you can't see it, it's 100% going on, and the research is showing that more and more every single day. So I think that was just a logical place to start when it comes to the physical side effects. And we could talk about cardiovascular system for a long time. We could talk about more and more side effects. I want to give you the chance to talk about one more, which I know isn't really a fair question, right? If I'm asking you to pull out one more physical side effect. Before we get to the mental side of things, is there another physical side effect or two that you're seeing in your research that has you the most concerned if we're looking even beyond the cardiovascular system?
Well, I would rank number 2 after the cardiac effects. I would rank the suppression of normal testicular function. If you had come to me 20 years ago and said, "Well, Dr. Pope, what about the possibility that steroids suppress the ability of the testis to manufacture testosterone and sperm cells," I would have assured you that once you stop the steroids, that the system would eventually return completely to normal, that everything would reset itself and the testosterone levels and sperm counts would come back to normal. And I would have been dead wrong, because it turns out, as time has gone by and as we have done more and more research in this area, not only in my laboratory, but in laboratories around the world, that in many cases, the testis does not recover quickly. and it may take a couple of years before testosterone levels start to come back truly towards normal, and sperm counts come back towards normal. And in some cases, it now appears that the damage may be permanent, that there may not be a full recovery even over the course of a lifetime. So this is really quite worrisome. And the reason that we didn't figure this out sooner, and the reason that we didn't know a lot about the cardiac effects sooner, is that widespread use of steroids didn't really occur until the 80s, as you pointed out earlier, and even the 90s in other countries. So if you have one of these older steroid users, somebody who started steroids at the age of 23 way back in the mid 1980s, that guy is now still only middle-aged. He's only gone through middle age. He hasn't even gotten very old yet. And so it's only now that we're beginning to see these long-term effects on the heart and on endocrine function. And it's becoming much more obvious than it was 10 years ago that these effects are worse than we had bargained for.
I mean, it makes sense. So you just go back to the beginning of your conversation when you said you were, started looking at these when the 80s, when it first became popular. In the grand scheme of things, that's pretty new when you compare it to other substances that are out there that are being used, right? So that makes sense. And that's why I think there's still, we're still learning with this stuff. And that's why I know you're still doing research, and I think there's still more research to come, is because there's still a lot to look at, especially when it comes to the long term. And again, especially when I'm talking to younger students, it's sometimes hard to emphasize that because, it's not going to happen right away. You're not going to see, but who knows what else is still to come out. And I do think that cardiovascular, there's so much that I think we still have to learn with that. And I think that's why it's important that you're doing the research that you're doing, so we can continue to learn, the impact that this usage has down the road, especially if you're in it for a while. And there's so much more that we could even talk about on the physical side of things. And I know that just for time, we'll kind of wrap up with those two. But obviously, if you go to our website, you can just look up Dr. Skip Hope's work, and I'll put some links to that in the show notes. You can look at more and more into the physical side of the research and what it's showing when it comes to side effects. But those are important to know for those that are using this stuff and what can happen, especially when it comes to long-term use. And I want to take the physical side of things and transfer that conversation and kind of wrap up our talk with the mental side of things, with the psychological side of these side effects of these drugs, right? Because at the end of the day, what we've talked about before is these drugs, at the core of it, are synthetic hormones, and hormones are just one of the contributing factors to behavior in general, right? So I'm curious what you're seeing on that side of things, what your research is showing, and when it comes to that, are you seeing psychiatric disorders as a result of steroid use? Is that the right word I should be using with this? And if so, what does that often look like? How does it often manifest itself on the psychiatric side of the use?
Well, the first thing to say about that is that the psychiatric effects of steroids are very uneven. That there are many guys who take tons of steroids, large doses, stacks of different steroids together, and don't have any psychiatric side effects to speak of, and are very much the same on steroids and coming off steroids. But for some reason that science doesn't fully understand, there is a minority of steroid users get quite a lot of psychiatric effects from them. And in a very small minority, the effects can be really dangerous. But the problem is there's no way to predict in advance whether you will be one of that small minority who is vulnerable or not. And the effects are that when you take steroids, there is a risk that you could develop so-called hypomanic symptoms, where you get euphoria, irritability, recklessness, grandiose feelings, exaggerated self-confidence, hyperactivity, including sexual hyperactivity, and other related symptoms. Then when you come off of steroids and get this temporary period of low testosterone that I have discussed, then the risk is that you could get depression and have depressed mood, loss of interest or pleasure in usual activities, disruption of sleep and appetite, and even suicidal feelings, which, as we both know, was the cause of the death of Taylor Hooton himself, and the reason that we're both having this conversation today. Now, what is very strange is that if you look at people withdrawing from anabolic steroids, and even if you look at laboratory studies where people deliberately had their testosterone level artificially suppressed almost to zero, 90% of people don't get depressed. They may lose their sex drive. They almost certainly will lose their sex drive. They may feel somewhat tired and sluggish, but they don't get depressed. But then the other 10% of people do get depressed, and sometimes can get profoundly depressed. And it doesn't have anything to do with your prior personality. It doesn't have anything to do with other environmental factors. It just seems to be due to some sort of biological predisposition that some people carry around and that other people don't. In the early days, when I first started writing about this, people said, "Oh, well, that's just if you're irritable and unpleasant to start with, then you'll just become even more that way when you take steroids." Or maybe it's just the power of suggestion. Maybe it's just that when you're in the gym, you sort of learn that you're supposed to act aggressively, or maybe there's some other expectational factors. Well, how do you sort that out? How do you find out whether this is just purely a psychological reaction or whether it actually has some sort of a chemical basis in the brain? Well, the way that you do that in science is to do a placebo-controlled double-blind study. So what I did and what 2 or 3 other investigators did is to do a study where we gave high doses of testosterone to people at one point and then gave them injections of an inert placebo with no testosterone at another point, where both the study participant and the scientist were both blinded as to whether the person was getting the real steroid or whether they were getting the inert placebo. And under these double-blind conditions, which effectively eliminates the power of suggestion, we were able to show that a small percentage of people develop quite pronounced hypomanic symptoms of irritability, aggressiveness, etc. And yet, despite those findings, we still don't know for sure what the chemical imbalance is that is causing that minority of people to get these reactions. And this is a serious consideration because occasionally there's at the tip of the distribution are people who are very, very susceptible to this effect and will have a Jekyll and Hyde transformation in their personalities and will go out and kill somebody, or commit a violent crime when in the past they've never hurt a fly. So it's urgent to try to figure out what causes this, but at the moment we just don't know.
And I think that goes back to what we just discussed is the need for even more research, and it's why you continue to look at these kinds of things, because I do think it's important, to connect those dots is important to understand the why, but I also think it's just important to discuss even right now the what, because it is just a real risk, right? That's kind of when we do our presentations, we talk about the chance that this kind of behavior could happen. You don't really know if it will or not. You can't guarantee it, but it's a possibility, and obviously we know the roles it can play when it, like you said, comes to Taylor's story as well. So I think the psychiatric behavior aspect of these drugs can oftentimes be just as serious as the physical side of things. It's part of the reason why, again, we go back to that kickoff phrase, health issue, because this ties in as well. And one of the other areas that I know you're doing research on, especially when it comes to the mental side effects of these drugs, is the neurotoxicity of them, which to simplify that is basically looking at how do these drugs affect the nervous system themselves. And I know I've even seen some of your research, how it is relating to memory loss and things like that. What are you seeing when it comes to neurotoxicity and the use of steroids?
Well, that's a tough question because the jury is still out on this one. It all started back in 2006 when a research group at Yale tried exposing human brain cells to various different levels of testosterone in a petri dish in the laboratory. And they found that if you expose the brain cells to higher levels of testosterone than are normally present, that the cells would die off prematurely. It's a process called apoptosis. And the investigators said, if this is really true and these neural cells are dying prematurely, then it's possible that bodybuilders and guys who use steroids over the long term could be damaging their brains and actually could develop a dementia before, at a premature age. And so after reading that paper, we went and did a study in England back in 2011 where we gave a bunch of cognitive tests that ran on an iPad to a group of guys who had used steroids and a comparison group who had not used steroids. And by golly, the ones who had used steroids were clearly impaired on visual spatial memory. In other words, the computer would show you a whole bunch of little squiggles, and then you had to remember it would show you two squiggles side by side, one of which was one that you had previously seen, and the other of which was a different one. And you had to point out the one that you had previously seen. And the steroid users were significantly impaired relative to the non-users on that. And the degree of impairment got worse and worse the longer you had been taking steroids in your lifetime. So that was sort of scary. And we then came back to the United States and did a comparable pilot study here. The results were not nearly as worrisome as they had been in England. We then got a big grant, which has been paying for research for the last 5 years. And so far, here in the United States, we have not found the same degree of impairment. Meanwhile, in Oslo, Norway, there's one of the world's leading research teams headed by a woman named Astrid Bjørnebekk is finding quite a lot of brain pathology in steroid users. So the question is, we found it in England, Bjørnebekk finds it in Oslo, but so far we have not found a whole lot of it in Boston. And none of us can figure out exactly what it is that is different. So as I say, there's reason to worry, but the more data and more research is needed before we're going to fully understand what's going on here.
Yeah, somehow the memory loss hasn't made it through customs when it gets to the U.S. yet, right? That's part of we got to figure out why that is.
Guess.
But it's important to look at. I mean, because I think it's just part of the equation. I mean, that's really, there's so many reasons why I wanted to have this conversation. One, selfishly, just for myself, to kind of pick your brain and see what you're learning and see what you're going to continue doing research on. But I also think the important part of this conversation, is for, at the end of the day, to, lack of a better word, almost provide a deterrent for a lot of this use, because I think it's clear I think we can both agree on this. High levels of long-term anabolic steroid use, obviously done for non-legitimate medical reasons, can have very dangerous side effects. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. We're still learning what those dangerous side effects can be. So, I mean, let's take that concept, knowing the danger involved in at play with this usage, and kind of end our conversation with this. In your opinion, how do you think we go about preventing this use? How do we bring down those usage ratio numbers that you mentioned before? What's our next step when it comes to kind of preventing a lot of these dangers that we're talking about?
Well, I think probably the single most important thing is for people to know what science has found out over the last 10 or 20 years about these long-term effects. Take, for example, cigarettes. If you look at movies shot in the 1940s and 1950s, everybody was smoking cigarettes. Now, you hardly ever see people smoking cigarettes, certainly in the movies and even in ordinary life. And that's partly because science did not know about how dangerous cigarettes could be in the long term back in the 40s and 50s. And then the research came out, and eventually it became clear beyond a doubt that there really were serious long-term dangers from cigarette use, and gradually fewer and fewer people used them. And it seems to me that a similar process is hopefully going to happen with steroids, that 20 years ago, science did not fully know how serious the cardiac effects might be, how serious the neuroendocrine effects might be. And so many people took steroids without any real worries about the long-term dangers. But now that we've got a lot of research under our belts, and it's pretty clear what these long-term dangers are, it's important for guys who are contemplating taking steroids to know a little bit about this research and to realize that this is something that they have to take into consideration. And this is important because if you go to your local gym and you talk to somebody who's used steroids, he'll tell you that he hasn't had any problem with them, and he doesn't even know any of his friends who have had a serious problem with him. And that's true. The short-term effects of steroids are very modest. It's the long-term effects that are dangerous. And if it's hard to persuade a 20-year-old guy that he might have a heart attack when he's 60 because he wants to look big, next month. But the more that we can tell people that this is a long-term game, and you have to be looking at what's going to happen to you decades down the pike, that's probably the single best tool that we have in terms of deterring excessive use of these drugs.
Yeah, I agree. It's talking about it, right? Whatever form that looks like. I mean, that's basically why we exist, right? Boil that down to education, and education through research, through people like you and what you're doing and what you're seeing, because ultimately presenting people with that information, I think is what will prevent this stuff. And I'm with you. I do truly hope. I mean, we believe it. That's why we do what we do. But the more that we can see this stuff, the more we can talk about this stuff, the more research that comes out about this stuff. Hopefully we start to see some of this usage come down, just knowing, that it's not worth it in the long run because of everything that you and I just talked about. And so that's really at the core of why I wanted to have this conversation, to present that research and talk about this more and allow people to see, what can happen if you get involved with this stuff. Right. So it's all part of a very important conversation that I think needs to be happening more. And I want to thank you for having that conversation with me today, but I also want to thank you for doing a lot of research in this area. I think there's still a lot that needs to be done. But what you're doing, I think, is making a difference, because we're going to be able to look back and say, well, because of what Dr. Pope learned and others have shown us, here's why we should stay away from this. So thank you for, not only sharing your expertise today, but for the great work that you're doing. I look forward to seeing what you continue to learn about this stuff, and together, through education, through research, I do think this will make a difference in the long run when it comes to this stuff.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances, and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.